Hi, and welcome back to the Life of a Writer. So, today I'm going to focus on food preparation, which is a key part of taking care of this writer and probably many writers. So, this week coming up, I have a very busy week with my serial novel, which is my main writing project, The Girl on Harlow Street, which runs on Patreon. And I'm going to do a separate video down the line on that project and the work that it has entailed and will entail in the future. But for now, I'm just going to mention a few things very, very quickly so that I can get on to the food focus for today. So every month on Patreon, I provide patrons with a newsletter, a video, 2 articles, and then that month's series of episodes. So that's usually 4 or 5 episodes. They come out every Friday. And usually I work ahead on this. So in the past, sometimes I've worked up to 6 months ahead. So I have 6 months worth of content already pre-scheduled for patrons on Patreon. Other times I do it a couple months in advance, but this time, probably because we had Christmas in there and it's been very busy and I've been trying to get these new projects off the ground, or at least the new direction on YouTube, I am doing the content for March now. And so this involves quite a bit of work. And in the next week, probably the next week and a half, I'm going to be focusing on The Girl on Harlow Street primarily. And so I will be, and want to, in the next week. I've actually had to write a list down here just to make sure that I get everything right. I have to film the video for March. I have to create March's newsletter. I am going to write 2 articles, as I always do, and those articles usually pertain to the content of that month's episodes. So I'm going to write the 2 articles, and then I'm going to go through each episode with a fine-tooth comb and make sure that there are no last-minute errors or mistakes. And this time around, because this is a completely new section of the story that nobody has read before on the website run that I did for the first version of the novel, I may have to write 1 or 2 new episodes to act as a bridge between this new section and the main novel that everybody's read. So needless to say, I have a busy week or 2 coming up, and this in the past has been a time where I have really slipped up with my self-care and my diet. When I'm busy doing the Girl on Harlow Street stuff, that's typically the time when I will start ordering in and going to these fast, quick meals that aren't always the healthiest. And so this time around, I'm doing some food preparation ahead of time so that I have these healthy meals, at least for the first 3 days of the process. And I'm going to share some video footage of me preparing these 3 meals today. So these are lunches, and essentially they're the same lunch. I can only really do 3 days because I think I would get bored and I'd have to try different recipes after that. So to start off this food preparation, what you're going to do, if you want to follow along, or what I did, is I baked 2 sweet potatoes in the oven. I sliced them up into the sizes that you can see on the video. I tossed them in olive oil, added a little bit of salt and pepper and some spices, and cooked them for about 35 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And then while they were cooking, then I prepared the quinoa. And the quinoa, I boiled 1 cup of quinoa to 1 cup of water until the quinoa absorbed all the water, and then, put that on standby for the main part of the food preparation. While this was happening, I also boiled some beets, and you can see there from the video the size that I chopped those beets into, and I boiled them until they were not too mushy, so they were firm. I want to say tender but firm, and then set those aside as well. So then, with those aside, I began to prep some of the other ingredients for these three meals. So another thing I did was I took a can of mixed beans and I drained that can into a colander, ran it under water, drained the beans, and then set those aside in a bowl as well, again for a little bit later. So the cheese that I'm using for this recipe, and I put cheese in air quotation marks, is by a company called Nuts for Cheese. So it actually is a vegan product. It's not dairy, but it is delicious. And it comes in different flavors, but the flavor that I chose was artichoke and herb. So that's the flavor I chose. And I started out by chopping that up into small slices and then transferring that to a bowl and setting it aside. Following that, I chopped some green onions very finely and then transferred those to a separate bowl also. After that, I chopped up some tomatoes, and after chopping these tomatoes, also transferred those to a bowl. And then I moved on to kale. And again, I just grabbed a couple of kale leaves, they're very big, and then sliced them roughly. I'm not being super fine and super meticulous with this, but chopped the kale up and then transferred that to a bowl. And then once I'd finished chopping the kale, I got all my ingredients together on the table, adding to that a bowl of olives. These were just Kalamata off olives from a jar, and then some balsamic vinaigrette salad dressing. And the one that I used was Kraft, but you could use any, you could make your own, but just half a cup of balsamic vinaigrette. And then I added the ingredients together. So starting with the quinoa and then adding all of the ingredients in sequence into the bowl, finally adding the olives, adding the balsamic vinaigrette, and then stirring everything up and then setting that aside. With the beans, I took the beans, added some balsamic vinaigrette, not as much as with the other one, so probably about a quarter of a cup. It was quite light. And then some spices. This spice happens to be from a local farm near where we live, so it's a dill mix, but you could add any spices that you want to this, and then just mix it in with the vinaigrette and the beans and then set that aside. Then brought everything together. To the mix, I also had some baby spinach and some carrots and some cucumber, and then I began to assemble my 3 lunches in the containers. So adding the quinoa, the bean salad, the spinach, the cucumber, the carrots. Of course, because the beets were still hot and the sweet potatoes were still hot, I had to wait for those to cool down. But eventually when those were ready, then I added those to my containers. And then as a result, I had 3 delicious lunches for the next 3 days. Much better than just ordering in on Skip the Dishes or Uber Eats, having these meals waiting for me in the fridge. On top of this, I also prepared a fruit bowl, and to this fruit bowl I added Bosc pears, plums, grapes, and some blackberries, and had that fruit bowl on standby as well. And then finally, you can see here I've got the fruit bowl, and I have my 3 containers lined up for the next 3 days. And then in addition to that, I prepared a basket of fairly healthy snacks to have. Now, I actually happen to be diabetic, so I can't eat a lot of sugar, and I certainly wouldn't be able to eat all of that fruit. I have to share it with Francisco, and I can have some of it very sparingly. But I have to eat fairly regularly, and so to have this basket of snacks on hand is also super, super helpful. So in a future video, as I said, I'm going to share what the work for Patreon entails and the different things I have to do and how they're actually done. But I need to have the physical strength and the fuel to do the creative work, and food is a core part of that. So I will link in the video description a more accurate, detailed version of this recipe, but I don't even want to call it a recipe because it's really just a collection of salads together, but I highly recommend it. It takes probably about 45 minutes to put this all together, but it's a 45 minutes well spent and definitely a lot more cost effective and a lot healthier than ordering food in. So I will see you next week on The Life of a Writer. Thank you.